You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast coming to you from Montecito, California. But before we begin, I do want to remind you that there is a website associated with this podcast called wealthformula.com. That's where you can go to get a number of resources and also to potentially join our investor club. If you are an accredited investor and are interested in potentially taking advantage of what I think was going to be potentially blood in the street pretty soon, then join our investor club. This is, of course, limited accredited investors are those who either make $200,000 per year, $300,000 if filing jointly, or have a net worth of $1 million outside of their personal residence. So that's what an accredited investor is. You don't have to apply for anything. You just either are or you aren't. And if you meet these criteria and you want to be part of our investor club, go to wealthformula.com, sign up, get onboarded, and let the games begin. Now, speaking of investing, it has been a rough year, a tough year for real estate investors. Inflation, interest rates have created distress and uncertainty. But let me remind you of a few things. First of all, investing isn't for the faint-hearted. Everyone loses at some point, and that is something that I think sometimes we forget. The idea that you can always win. It's a fallacy. And of course, everyone would agree with that statement rationally. However, our brains are not wired to think rationally in stressful times. It's a tall order. You see, there's a concept in psychology called loss aversion. That means we are wired to fear loss more than we desire gain. So if you have an investment go bad in a distressed market, you might let the fear of future losses prevent you from investing in an asset that might create more significant gains down the road. In other words, when the market's down and you should be investing, your typical psychology is not to invest because you're afraid, because you might have already had some losses and you don't want any more. The problem with that is, of course, that's the best time to buy. Now, the Chinese word for crisis is the same word for opportunity. And that's a very useful way to think about it, because when there is blood in the streets, you want to activate your instincts as a predator more than that of the hunted. You know, that's something the world's greatest investors will tell you. And by the way, those investors, those world's greatest investors, they've all lost money at some point in their life. So it's okay if you do too. Now, go back to basics, though. Think about why you're doing this. Why do you invest your money rather than leave it in the bank in the first place? I invest my money because leaving it in the bank is a way to guarantee loss of purchasing power. Think about it. Last year, inflation soared over double digits. And would you have even gotten 1% return on the money in the bank? Well, no. So the money in the bank guarantees a loss of real buying power. And in last year, it would have guaranteed a double-digit loss. And that's a guaranteed loss, right? That's the point. Now, why do you invest in real estate or other alternative assets instead of only a portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds? Well, I invest in alternatives because they can result in extraordinary returns. I've experienced that over and over again. And taking some losses now, honestly, is not going to change my view of investing in the future. I really do stand by this notion, and I will say it again. No one ever gets rich with a portfolio of stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. You're already rich, and maybe you put money in stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, and at some point, maybe they preserve your wealth, and maybe you got some modest growth, but you're never going to make that money change your fundamental socioeconomic status, right? So with alternatives, I've seen that personally. And I'm willing to take a little bit more risk for that larger reward. And frankly, so far, it has paid dividends for me, at least now. The point of all of this is to say that decision-making in personal finance is like anything else, right? The hardest part of it is to stay rational and not let fear or other emotions cloud your thoughts. My guest on this week's episode of Wealth Formula Podcast knows all about making decisions under distress. He's a fighter pilot who has had to think clearly to avoid death. He'll tell you that story himself. And well, it's the same type of thinking you're going to need to do if you're going to make money as an investor in this unpredictable world and in this distressed market. Anyway, when we come back, I want you to, when we come back, you're going to hear from that fighter pilot, and hopefully it helps you to get some clarity on your own thinking. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest on Wealth Formula Podcast is Hazard Lee. He's a fighter pilot, author, and speaker, and the author of The Art of Clear Thinking, Stealth Fighters, Pilots, Timeless Rules for Making Tough Decisions. Hazard, welcome to the program.
Buck, thanks for having me on.
So you have a pretty distinguished background. I mean, I think from my understanding, you're kind of like, when you talk about Top Gun and everybody's seen the, Top Gun movies and all that, you were sort of the Top Gun of the Top Guns, right? You were kind of like the Tom Cruise character. Is that right?
I wouldn't say that. So I'm I'd say an average fighter pilot. Got a chance to fly some awesome jets, the F-16, F-35. Plus, we're Air Force, so we tend to rag on the Navy quite a bit.
Oh, okay, got it. So you don't want to be associated with the Navy types.
No, and especially since my brother's an F-18 pilot, so we go back and forth quite a bit.
Got it. So what do you think in terms of your, I guess the question is, what was that like, and how did you frame that when you ultimately ended up writing this book? I mean, you must have realized at some point that you were doing things systematically, and that you could actually package it up and for people to potentially use for other decision-making processes.
Yeah, that's right. So as a fighter pilot, really, if you boil down my job, go past Top Gun, it's to just make decisions. So when we fly, we're making thousands of decisions each flight, often with incomplete information and lives on the line. So you really need somebody who's a great decision maker in the cockpit. And the reason is because that we are leveraging technology. So I'm sitting in this tub of technology that allows me to do 1,000 times more than I could do on my own. So I can fly 100 times faster than I could run. I can carry far more. I can see out to the horizon. So it's highly leveraged. Each decision you're making can impact the battlefield quite a bit. And just a four F-35s today, I mean, each jet's about $100 million. The helmets we wear are about $400,000 a piece, true augmented reality. So it's putting circles and diamonds over all the good and bad guys out there. So you can do a lot from the cockpit. But the way I frame the book is that we're all like that right now. So the phone you have in your pocket, it can do the job of dozens of people from just a few years ago. Same thing with your computer, with your phone. So all the decisions that we're making are highly leveraged now. And a way to look at that is through our energy consumption. The average human only burns about 90 watts of electricity, and yet our consumption is 12,000 watts. That's powering the technology, that's leveraging the decisions we're making. And with AI on the rise, it's only getting better or worse, depending on how you look at it. And right now, there are reports out of Silicon Valley that the next billion-dollar company will be run by 3 or fewer people because of AI. So a billion-dollar company from 100 years ago, that would have taken hundreds of thousands of people. From a few decades ago, just a few thousand people. And now 3 people will be in charge of $1 billion. And that's a lot of leverage to each one of those decision makers.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about some of the points that you make in your book. So you talk about clear thinking and how clear thinking may be more valuable than raw intelligence. Do you want to if you want to talk a little bit about that, make that distinction?
Yeah, I think we all kind of know that from an intuitive level, that more information does not necessarily mean that you're able to understand the world better. So I think the reason we learn these mental models is to be able to predict the future. So no matter what you're trying to do, you're trying to predict the future, especially in your line of work with investing. You're trying to see, what's going to maximize your dollar. And so I think just because you have more information doesn't mean you're necessarily thinking clearer. And that's a big problem today. There's far more information now out there with the internet, with social media, than there has been in the past. And we're all inundated with far more than we can absorb. And that's something we experience as fighter pilots. We have a lot of information coming in at us, and we have to narrow down our field of view through what's known as a cross-check, focusing on the few variables out there that make a larger return on investment than what they might first appear.
What is the ACE helix, and how can regular people apply that ACE helix to their decision making?
So ACE helix is it's a framework that we use for making decisions. So growing up, I think I'm like a lot of people, didn't learn any kind of theory on decision making. It's not taught in most schools. And the Air Force has done a pretty incredible job. They'll take somebody who's never flown before, and within just a couple years, they'll be flying combat missions on the other side of the world. And I think a large part of that is due to this decision-making framework called the ACE helix. So assess, choose, and execute. So first, you need to assess the problem in front of you. If you're not able to consistently do that, you won't be able to consistently make good decisions. After that, you have to choose the correct course of action. And then lastly, you have to be able to execute on that decision. So it sounds simple. It is, but it can be difficult to actually do consistently.
Well, I think one of the problems, and particularly I'm guessing, in a combat type situation is, that's where the clear thinking part comes back, and as I mentioned before, I'm a former surgeon, and the first thing that you do when you assess somebody who's down on the ground is airway, breathing, circulation, right? But sometimes it's not easy to remember those those simple things when it seems like somebody's about to die, right? So I guess it's a similar idea, is trying to assess in real time, like when you feel, particularly because of stress. And I think that that's kind of where I'm going with this, is that we are, in the investor side, we're kind of living in a volatile space. We've got rising interest rates, asset values have come down a bit, inflation, all that kind of stuff. So how do you look at it? I mean, if you looked at it from this perspective of an investor, how would you apply this ACE helix broadly?
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. And the Air Force has done quite a few studies on stress. And what they found, originally it was because they were finding that good pilots during World War II were dying from dumb mistakes in the heat of combat. And so they've done a lot of studies since, and they've really shown that as stress increases, initially it can be a good thing, but once it gets too stressful, your IQ decreases. And so we have a saying as fighter pilots that as soon as you put on your helmet, you lose 20 IQ points. And that's just because what looks simple on the ground at 1G, at 0 knots, gets pretty difficult when you're flying. You're under 2,000 pounds of force. It's hot in the cockpit. You're flying at closure speeds, a mile every 3 seconds. So so your brain function, your cognitive ability to make decisions decreases once you get outside of that zone of performance. So we do a lot as fighter pilots to try and maintain that zone. And the number one thing you can do is preparation. So there's a lot of little tricks and tips that we use, but the number one thing is being prepared. You don't rise to the level of your expectation, you fall to the level of your preparation. And so we go out and we design our training scenarios to be even more difficult than combat. And we will spend a lot of time trying to get as good as we possibly can be. And then we'll spend a lot of time debriefing. When we go and fly, we'll spend about an hour and a half flying, and we will spend 2 to 6 hours debriefing that sortie, going through everything that went wrong and how we can be better. So I think the number one thing is being prepared. Outside of that, we do breathing exercises. So we have box breathing, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, or hold 5 seconds, 5 seconds out, hold 5 seconds. And that can be pretty effective for activating your parasympathetic nervous system, decreasing your heart rate, because what we found is new students, when they go to the tanker, so tanker's airborne aircraft that we refuel from, fully manual maneuver, you're taught your whole career never to hit another aircraft, and now you're intentionally touching another aircraft while it's transferring you fuel at 350 miles an hour. We found their heart rates were getting to about 170 beats per minute. They're just sitting in a seat. And so at that heart rate, you don't have that fine motor acuity that you need. So they're, as we say, squeezing the paint out of the stick. So we do these breathing exercises to try and slow their heart rate down so they can have that fine motor skill. But we also found that it's a big factor when it comes to making decisions. So just like it affects your hand-eye coordination, it also affects your ability to make good decisions.
How is success more attainable when you plan for multiple outcomes?
Well, I think you have to be prepared for multiple outcomes. There's a lot of uncertainty in the world. Very few decisions will you have 100% certainty in the outcome of it. So I think you need to plan for contingency scenarios. When things go wrong, you need to be ready to be able to act on that.
You talk a little bit about power laws. How is that relevant here to decision making?
So that is a factor with the assess phase of the decision-making framework. So being able to find those few key variables. So 3 power laws encompass just about everything you're going to see out there. One is exponential growth. So I'm sure you're familiar with that from the financial world, compound interest. Next is the law of diminishing return. We're all familiar with that from going to the gym. First 6 months, you're going to see a lot of gains. After that, if you keep the workout the same, you're going to see somewhat of a plateau. That can explain everything from why you only need a little bit of detergent when you're washing your clothes to why supercars are so expensive. And then lastly, long tail power laws. That's why a few shows on Netflix do really well and the rest don't do so great. So those power laws are really what you want to focus in on. And it can be challenging because as humans, we've really evolved to think linearly. You walk 30 steps, you're now 30 steps away. But really, when you are amplifying decisions with technology, for instance, in my world, speed, we sometimes have to, fortunately, I've never had to, we have ejection seats where a rocket is in your seat. It'll send you out of the aircraft if the aircraft's going to crash. So the number one thing to do, even though there are dozens of steps in the checklist, is just to slow down. That's because force is exponential on your body as speed increases. So there are a lot of little variables out there that you can look at and identify those power laws. And those are the things you need to factor in when you're making a decision.
How about fast forecasting? Talk a little bit about what that is and how you would apply that in both a plane and in everyday life.
Yeah, so fast forecasting is essentially just coming up with the answer to the equation. When you're making a decision, you just want to find the expected value. So what is the good that's going to happen from it? What's the chance of that happening? Minus the risk. What's the bad? What's the chance of that happening? Now, it can be difficult for people to put in exact numbers. What's the probability of something happening? But the real answer is that it's difficult for everything out there. Computer programs, we have some very elaborate computer programs in the military, and we've made the mistake in the past of overly trusting those, because if you just have one variable that's that you don't quite understand, we call it the base of sand problem. So we have these elaborate computer models built on these unstable bases, and it can spit out the wrong answer. So really, one of the themes of the book is for an expert to trust their intuition. I think as a society, we've really gone the route of putting too much trust in computer models, in consultants, in committees, and not really holding ourselves accountable for finding the answer to that equation. What's the expected value of the decision that you're going to make? And so I think every leader out there needs to be able to find the expected value of a decision before they start consulting those outside resources. And that'll do one of two things. That will either double check those resources to make sure they're correct, or if you're wrong, it'll show you the flaw in your thinking and you'll be able to improve over time.
When you talk a little bit about this, about fear in particular, I guess I want to come back to that. How can people train themselves to overcome fear? You talked a little bit about breathing exercises, but I feel like there's a sort of there's different kinds of fear as well, right? I mean, there's fear you're going to be shot down in a moment, the kind of stuff that, you would feel potentially in combat. That's a different kind of fear, or maybe it's not, but it's sort of an acute version of an investor worried about his or her portfolio and a decision-making process. How do you train yourself to overcome that fear if you're just a person on a daily basis trying to make those decisions?
Yeah, I think it's the same fear. So that's actually one of the things that you get pretty good at as a fighter pilot. When you go into combat, after you come back, everything seems kind of easy when you're not getting shot at, or you don't have the risk of having to eject over enemy territory. it gets a lot easier to make decisions, because most decisions in society aren't that difficult. You're not going to get eaten by a lion out here. When it comes to being able to manage your fear, I think being able to have a good mindset, being able to stay in the present moment, positive self-talk, I think that's been a big push for the Air Force in the last 5 to 10 years, is being able to focus on that human performance aspect, being able to manage your fear. Being prepared, as we talked about before, is the single best thing you can do. But outside of that, I would say being able to have positive self-talk, not having to berate yourself. That's kind of my job as an instructor. I get a chance to teach some of the best pilots in the world how to fly the F-35, and they're tremendous at what they do. They're great from a stick and rudder perspective, but oftentimes you'll see that they'll make a mistake and it'll snowball out of control. So they'll make one mistake, they'll be thinking about how they failed the ride, how they might fail out of pilot training, and that'll lead to a second mistake, because now their mental bandwidth is tied up in that, those thoughts about fear. And, if you made a mistake, you actually need more bandwidth to be able to get yourself out of that. So because we're flying so fast, a mile every 3 seconds, it just takes a few bad mistakes to get yourself into a position that can be dangerous. So that's part of my job, is to be able to mentor some of these pilots to get them up to a position where they can be mentally resilient.
So I think you've also mentioned that stress can become calming in a way. Is that right? So how does that happen?
So I think stress, first of all, it keeps you from being complacent. So you need a little bit of stress out there. So if you're doing something that's boring, that's not exciting you, you're not getting butterflies in your stomach, then, I think you're not using your emotion to kind of push yourself. In terms of being calming, I would say I've had a few incidences where I've come pretty close to dying, and every one of those times, and this isn't like a macho thing, every one of those times there was no fear. It was detached curiosity, because I was trained in what I needed to do, and all those background thoughts went away. It's like meditation times 1,000. You're just focusing on the few things you need to do to survive. And, looking back, it's actually pretty amazing. I don't want to put myself back into that position, but it's something pretty special when all those background thoughts go away and you're just focused on a few things. And so one of the times I talk about in the book is when I put an F-35 out of control. I was dogfighting when I was a young fighter pilot, and ended up running out of airspeed, going into the vertical straight up, and started going backwards in the F-16, something it wasn't designed to do, and went out of control. Fortunately, I was able to recover it a few thousand feet above the ground. But yeah, it's one of those things where everything just clears out of your brain. You're just focused on how to survive. Detached curiosity is the best way to describe it. And then the fear comes maybe a couple hours later when you're finally, alone by yourself.
Was that in real combat, or was that in like training?
This was just training. So this was, I was a new F-16 pilot, and this is, one of those experiences that, decision-making, it's like the gears in a mechanical watch. A small, seemingly unimportant gear can really have a big impact on how that clock tells time. And so I was just a few miles an hour too slow, 5 miles an hour too slow to go into the vertical and do this loop, but it had a big impact on the outcome.
I think one of the problems that investors have is being able to sort of leave behind a previous bad decision or a previous situation and make the next decision clearly, right? I would imagine that relates to what you were talking about with snowballing.
Yeah, stay in the present moment. You don't want to use up mental bandwidth unnecessarily. And the best tool I know to do that is the debrief. So when you make a mistake in the moment, what I tell myself is I'll worry about that in the debrief, because we have a dedicated set aside time to focus on that. So I think that's one of the biggest issues that I see in organizations that don't do a lot of debriefing, is they try to do it real time. And again, you're using up that bandwidth that you have to make decisions on debriefing yourself, which should come at a separate scheduled time afterwards.
So tell me about the consulting work that you do now.
So I do quite a bit. So I worked with different airlines during COVID to help with their mental toughness program. So one in particular, they were having a lot of issues with their pilots during COVID. It was a difficult time. And so they wanted to work through this kind of, it seems more new age, how to stay mentally tough and mentally resilient. But it's something that we've really, focused on and made a hard syllabus on and shown the science behind during the last few years of Air Force pilot training. So I do some things like that also with decision making. So yeah, it's good to be able to get the word out there.
Well, looks like you also are kind of a prolific content creator. One of the most viewed military aviation channels on YouTube, 100 million views. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's fun to make content out there. So fortunately, it resonates with people. We get about 10 to 15 million views a month. And so what I really like to do is I like to entertain and educate people.
Sure.
And there's a lot of interesting stuff with the military aviation world, and people are really interested in it. Just like look at Top Gun, but I like to put a credible viewpoint behind that, and having a career as a fighter pilot helps me to do that.
What's that YouTube channel for anybody who wants to check it out?
It's just under my name. So Hazard with an S, HASARD. You can just type that into YouTube or any of the social media platforms, and you can see some interesting things.
Interesting. Where is that most of that content come from? Is it stuff that you're taking yourself, or is it stuff that's just archived and you're finding it and presenting it?
It's both. So I do have some videos of me flying and doing those things, but we go and actually make dedicated videos. So we went to the centrifuge a couple months back, and we brought UFC fighter Tito Ortiz. He wanted to see if he could withstand the G-forces, and spoiler, he was not able to do it. So, but I mean, the centrifuge spins you up to 9 Gs. So you weigh 2,000 pounds. The blood is being pulled out of your brain. Afterwards, you have what look like chicken pox from the blood vessels exploding.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's intense on the body, but yeah, did the centrifuge, went with an astronaut and did the 0G plane. So yeah, just try to do interesting things connected to aviation and military aviation. We just released a video of the most realistic dogfight footage ever recorded. We put cameras into test F-16s at Nellis Air Force Base. So it's been kind of a fun journey with that.
Very cool. Well, the book again is The Art of Clear Thinking, a stealth fighter pilot's timeless rules for making tough decisions. Hazard, I imagine that is available pretty much everywhere you buy books these days.
Yeah, correct. It's done really well. It was Wall Street Journal bestseller, #2 best-selling business book in the country last month. So it's been doing well. I did the audiobook.
Oh, good. Good.
For the first time in Audible history, I recorded parts from the cockpit of a jet.
Oh, so, that's very cool.
So yeah, it's pretty interesting, but anywhere you get books.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for being on Wealth Formula Podcast.
Buck, thanks for having me.
We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Now, I do think that there's a lot of parallels in that, and I do worry a little bit about the psychology that people have right now, I think, because of what's going on in the real estate market and because of some other stuff in the podcast ecosystem. And I just want to urge you to, think rationally. Think rationally. Think about what it is that you're doing. Learn from any mistakes. And sometimes you can lose even if you don't make a mistake, frankly. So that's okay too. Know that investing is not without risk, but the goal is you have to just win, more than you lose. And generally speaking, that has been the case for most people, certainly for me in the real estate world who've done it in a reasonable way. Anyway, that's it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.